The rain fell in slow, steady drops, tapping against the windshield of Jacob's car. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale under the dim glow of the streetlights. His breath was unsteady, his heart pounding with the weight of everything he had lost. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight he had promised himself he would change. But promises had become just words to him, words that always seemed to break. As he sat in the driver's seat, staring at his own weary reflection in the rearview mirror, flashes of his past played in his mind like an old film. The arguments, the late nights filled with regret, the people he had pushed away. And then there was her, Emily. The only person who had ever truly believed in him. The one who had stayed by his side through every mistake, every broken vow. But even she had her limits. The last time he saw her, tears had filled her eyes as she whispered, "I can't do this anymore, Jacob." That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment he realized he had nothing left. No family, no job, no future. He was a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown, unsure if he had the strength to step back. Then through the static of the radio, a voice cut through his thoughts. It was an old sermon from a preacher he used to listen to as a child, before life got complicated. Every journey to redemption starts with a single step. No matter how lost you are, there's always a way back. Jacob let out a slow breath, his hands trembling as he reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over Emily's number. Would she even answer? Did she still believe in him? He hesitated, then scrolled past her name to another contact, one he hadn't reached out to in years. Pastor Daniels, the man who had once told him, "You don't have to be perfect, son. You just have to be willing to try." With a deep inhale, he pressed the call button. Across town, Emily sat in her small apartment, staring out the window as the city lights flickered in the distance. Her heart was heavy, but not as heavy as the silence that filled the space where Jacob used to be. She wanted to believe in him. She wanted to believe that he could change. But belief alone wasn't enough. She had spent too many nights waiting for a different ending, only to wake up to the same heartbreak. Still, as she traced the rim of her coffee cup with her fingers, a thought crept into her mind. What if this time was different? What if, for the first time, he was truly ready to fight for himself? Meanwhile, Jacob sat in his car, gripping his phone as it rang. His pulse raced when the line clicked open. Jacob. The familiar voice of Pastor Daniels filled his ears, steady and calm. "Yeah, it's me," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a brief pause before the pastor spoke again. "Are you ready?" Jacob closed his eyes. The weight of years of mistakes pressed down on him, but in that moment, something shifted. He wasn't sure if it was hope or just desperation, but either way, he knew he had to try. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't think I can do this alone." A small smile lifted the corner of Pastor Daniel's lips on the other end of the call. "Then let's take this one step at a time." And so, with a deep breath and a heart full of uncertainty, Jacob put his car into drive. The road ahead was long, and the journey wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he had taken the first step. And sometimes that was enough. What happens next? Will Jacob find the strength to rebuild his life, or will the past pull him back in? Stay tuned for *12 Steps to Recovery*, a story of faith, redemption, and the power of second chances. The streetlights stretched endlessly before Jacob as he drove through the quiet city. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, streaking the windshield with thin silver lines. His hands gripped the wheel, knuckles still tense, as Pastor Daniel's words lingered in his mind. On step at a time. It sounded so simple, yet the weight of those words felt crushing. He had taken the first step by making the call, But what came next? What did recovery even look like for someone like him? As he pulled into the church parking lot, memories of his childhood flooded his mind. The wooden pews, the smell of old hymnals, the warmth of Sunday mornings when life had felt innocent and full of promise. But those days were long gone. Now, standing in the dim glow of the street lamp, he felt like a stranger, an outsider peering into a world that no longer belonged to him. The church doors creaked open, and there stood Pastor Daniels, dressed in a plain sweater and slacks, his face lined with age, but still carrying the same kindness Jacob remembered. "Come in," he said, his voice calm and steady. Jacob hesitated before stepping inside. The church was quiet, the air thick with something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was peace, or maybe it was just the unsettling quiet of being alone with his thoughts. Pastor Daniels led him to a small room off to the side, where two chairs faced each other. A coffee pot sat on a table nearby, the aroma filling the space. "You look like you could use a cup," the pastor said, pouring 2 mugs. Jacob nodded, wrapping his hands around the warmth. He stared into the dark liquid, unsure of what to say. "I appreciate you picking up," he finally muttered. The pastor leaned back, watching him with quiet patience. "You don't call someone after all these years unless something's weighing on you." Jacob let out a hollow laugh. "You could say that." He took a deep breath, his voice tightening. "I lost everything. Emily, my job, my friends. It's like I don't even recognize my own life anymore." Pastor Daniels nodded slowly, as if he had heard this story 100 times before. Losing things has a way of making us pay attention. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, staring at the floor. "I don't even know where to start." "The beginning's always a good place," the pastor said simply. Jacob hesitated, then finally let the words spill out. He talked about the years of bad decisions, the way alcohol and anger had become his closest companions. He spoke about Emily, the way she had held on for so long, believing in him even when he didn't deserve it. He talked about the nights he had promised her he'd change, only to let her down again and again. And then he talked about the last night, the final straw. The moment when she had looked at him, not with anger, but with something far worse, disappointment. "I don't know if she'll ever forgive me," Jacob admitted, his voice raw. Pastor Daniels sipped his coffee, his eyes thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't always the hardest part. Sometimes the real challenge is proving you've changed." Jacob exhaled, his chest heavy. "I don't even know if I can." The pastor leaned forward, his gaze steady. "That's why you don't do it alone." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn-out booklet. The cover read, "Asterisk 12 Steps to Recovery Asterisk." Jacob frowned, staring at it. "You think this is what I need?" "I think it's a place to start," Pastor Daniels said. "These steps, they aren't just about quitting bad habits. They're about facing yourself, owning what you've done, making things right." Jacob took the booklet, flipping through the pages. The words blurred slightly, the weight of them pressing against him. Asterisk admit you are powerless. Surrender to a higher power. Make amends where possible asterisk. The thought of making amends sent a chill down his spine. He had hurt so many people, Emily most of all. What if it was too late? Pastor Daniel seemed to sense his hesitation. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight. Just take the first step." Jacob nodded slowly, unsure of what that step even looked like. But something inside him told him to at least try. The next morning, he found himself parked outside Emily's apartment. His stomach twisted in knots as he stared at her window, the curtains drawn shut. He hadn't been here in weeks. The last time, he had stood on this very sidewalk, shouting her name, his voice slurred, his anger reckless. Now he felt like a different man, or at least a man trying to be different. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The air was cold, biting at his skin. With shaky hands, he knocked on the door. Minutes passed. Then the door creaked open just an inch. Emily stood there, her hair tied back, eyes wary. She didn't speak at first, just studied him, as if trying to decide whether he was real or just another false promise. "What do you want, Jacob?" Her voice was quiet, guarded. He swallowed hard. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "You've said that before." "I know." His voice was steady this time. "And I don't expect you to believe me. I need you to know that I mean it." She crossed her arms, shifting slightly. "And then what? You say sorry, and everything magically fixes itself." Jacob shook his head. "No, I don't expect that. I don't expect anything from you. I want to do better. Be better. And not just for you, for myself." For the first time, something in her expression softened, just a little. But the pain was still there, buried deep. "That's not something you can fix overnight, Jacob." "I know," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But I have to start somewhere." Emily was silent for a long moment. Then finally, she exhaled and stepped back, leaving the door slightly open. "I can't promise anything. But if you're really serious, I guess we'll see." Jacob nodded, his chest tightening. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a second chance. But it was something. And sometimes, something was enough. As he walked back to his car, the booklet still in his pocket, he knew the road ahead was long. The past wouldn't disappear. The damage wouldn't undo itself. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running from it. He was facing it, one step at a time. Jacob sat in his car outside Emily's apartment long after she had closed the door. The night was quiet except for the occasional passing car, its headlights cutting through the darkness. He exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel as the weight of the conversation settled in. He had expected anger, maybe even a slammed jaw, but her response had been even harder to face: uncertainty. She had left the door open, but only a crack. That was more terrifying than outright rejection. It meant the burden was on him to prove he had changed, and that was something he wasn't sure he knew how to do. The small booklet in his pocket felt heavier than it should. He pulled it out, flipping through the pages again. The words stared back at him, blunt and unforgiving. Asterisk, admit your mistakes. Make amends. Seek forgiveness, asterisk. They made it sound so simple. But his mistakes weren't just small stumbles. They were wreckage. And some wounds, once inflicted, never fully heal. A tap on his window jolted him from his thoughts. He turned to see a familiar face. Liam. Jacob's former best friend, now just another person he had pushed away. The last time they had spoken, things had ended in an ugly shouting match outside a bar, the kind of argument that leaves more scars than words should be able to. Jacob hesitated before rolling down the window. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice cautious. Liam folded his arms, nodding toward Emily's apartment. "Didn't expect to see asterisk you asterisk here either." His voice was tense, but not hostile. More like someone testing the waters, unsure of what lay beneath. Jacob sighed, rubbing his jaw. "I messed up, Liam. With Emily. With you. With a lot of people." Liam let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "That's an understatement." There was a long silence between them. The weight of old grudges, old betrayals, hung in the air like an unfinished conversation neither of them knew how to start. Finally, Liam leaned against the car, his expression unreadable. "You actually serious this time?" Jacob looked down at the booklet in his hands. Asterisk step 1. Take responsibility asterisk, he nodded. Yeah, I think I am. Liam studied him for a moment, then sighed. If that's true, you've got a lot of work to do. Jacob met his gaze. I know. Liam nodded once before pushing off the car. Emily deserves better than half-hearted promises, man. You either fix yourself, or you let her go for good. Jacob didn't argue. He just sat there, watching as Liam walked away, disappearing into the night. The next morning, Jacob forced himself out of bed early, something he hadn't done in years without a reason. The church parking lot was mostly empty when he arrived. Inside, a small group had gathered in a back room. People sitting in a quiet circle, their expressions tired but hopeful. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of old wood. Pastor Daniels greeted him with a nod. Glad you came. Jacob took a seat near the back, listening as the others shared their stories of loss, regret, redemption. Some had been walking this path for years. Others, like him, were just starting. Each voice carried a different pain, a different past, but they all had one thing in common: they weren't running anymore. When it was his turn to speak, Jacob hesitated. The words felt stuck, heavy in his throat. But then he thought about Emily, about Liam, about the long nights spent drowning in his own self-destruction. I don't know how to do this, he admitted finally. But I know I can't keep doing asterisk that asterisk. No one nodded. No one reassured him that everything would be fine. They just listened. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Later that evening, he found himself standing outside a familiar house. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows against the cracked pavement. He had avoided this place for a long time, knowing he had no right to show up after everything that had happened. But step 4 was clear: make amends where possible. And that meant facing the person he had hurt the most before Emily. He knocked. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and there she was, his mother. Her hair was streaked with more gray than he remembered, her eyes a little more tired. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, as if trying to decide whether she was looking at her son or a stranger. Jacob swallowed hard. Mom. She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. I stopped waiting for this moment a long time ago, Jacob. The words cut deeper than he had expected. But he didn't run. Not this time. I know, he said, his voice steady. But I'm here now. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then finally, she stepped aside, leaving the door open just a crack. Jacob exhaled. One step at a time. Jacob stepped inside his mother's house for the first time in years, and it felt both familiar and foreign all at once. The walls were the same, the furniture barely changed, but the warmth he remembered from childhood was gone. Instead, there was silence, the heavy kind, the kind filled with words left unspoken for too long. His mother stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching him carefully, as if bracing herself for disappointment. He couldn't blame her. He had given her plenty of reasons to expect the worst. I don't know what to say, Jacob admitted, his voice quiet. She sighed, shaking her head. Then why are you here? Jacob swallowed, searching for the right words. Asterisk step 4. Make amends asterisk. It sounded easy in the book. But standing here, looking into his mother's tired eyes, it felt impossible. I'm trying, he said finally, to be better. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You've said that before. I know. He exhaled, running a hand over his face. And I didn't mean it then. Not really. But this time, I don't want to be the person I was. Something in her gaze softened, just slightly. And what exactly does trying mean, Jacob? He hesitated before answering. I started going to meetings. I talked to Pastor Daniels. He exhaled. I'm taking it one step at a time. His mother let out a slow breath, glancing away. When she spoke, her voice was quieter and more careful. Do you remember the last time you were here? Jacob felt his stomach tighten. He wished he could forget. You came in drunk, she continued, her voice trembling. You broke the picture frames off the wall, shouted at me for trying to help you, and then left. I stayed up all night waiting for a phone call to tell me you were dead in a ditch somewhere. Her voice cracked slightly. Do you know what it's like to love someone and always be waiting for that asterisk call? Jacob clenched his jaw, guilt pressing against his ribs. I'm sorry, Mom. She shook her head. I want to believe that. Jacob nodded. That was all she could give him for now. And maybe that was fair. The visit didn't last long. She didn't offer him a hug when he left, didn't ask him to stay for dinner. But as he stepped onto the porch, she called after him. Jacob. He turned. If you really mean what you said, don't just say it. She said. Prove it. He nodded. I will. As he walked back to his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from an unknown number. Asterisk asterisk, meet me at the Lantern. We need to talk asterisk asterisk. His pulse quickened. He knew that place. It was an old bar just outside of town, the kind of place where fights broke out as easily as drinks were poured. A place where his past still had a grip on him. He hesitated before typing back. Asterisk asterisk, who is this asterisk asterisk? 3 dots appeared. Then asterisk asterisk, you owe me, Jacob. Don't make me come find you asterisk asterisk. Jacob's grip tightened around his phone. He didn't need to see the name to know who it was. Shane. A ghost from his past. A reminder of all the wrong turns he had taken. He sat in his car, staring at the message. Every part of him told him to ignore it, to drive away and leave that part of his life buried. But something told him that Shane wouldn't just disappear. And if there was anything Jacob had learned, it was that running never solved anything. The lantern was exactly as he remembered, dimly lit, smelling of cheap liquor and regret. The neon signs flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jacob stepped inside, his heart pounding. Shane was waiting at a back table, his expression unreadable. He looked the same, rough around the edges, the kind of man who thrived on chaos. Jacob sat across from him, his fists clenching under the table. What do you want? Shane smirked, straight to the point. I respect that. He leaned forward. Here's the thing, Jacob. You and I, we have unfinished business. Jacob's stomach turned. He knew exactly what Shane was talking about. The debt. The mistake that had led him down the darkest path of his life. I don't do that anymore, Jacob said firmly. Shane raised an eyebrow. That's cute. But see, the thing is, I don't really care what you do anymore. I care about what you asterisk me. Jacob swallowed. I don't have that money. Shane's smirk disappeared. That's a problem. The tension thickened between them, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Jacob knew Shane wasn't the kind of man to let things go. He also knew that if he wasn't careful, everything he had been working toward could come crashing down. Shane leaned back, his eyes cold. You've got 2 choices. You find a way to pay up, or, well, he smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Let's just say it won't be pretty. Jacob's jaw tightened. He had spent so long trying to fix things, trying to make amends. But his past wasn't done with him yet. And he had a sinking feeling that before this was over, he was going to have to make an impossible choice. Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared across the table at Shane. The words asterisk, it won't be pretty asterisk lingered in the air between them, heavy and final. He had known this moment would come eventually. His past had a way of catching up, no matter how hard he tried to outrun it. But he wasn't the same man he had been before. At least he didn't want to be. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "I don't have your money, Shane, and I'm not getting back into that life." Shane chuckled, but there was no amusement in it. "See, that's the thing, Jacob. It's not your asterisk decision anymore. You walked away, sure, but walking away doesn't erase what you owe." Jacob clenched his jaw. He had made mistakes, but this wasn't about money. It was about control. Shane didn't just want what was owed. He wanted to remind Jacob that he would never truly be free. Shane slid a piece of paper across the table. Jacob hesitated before looking down. "An address." "You've got 1 week," Shane said. "Meet me there and we figure this out. Or don't," and he shrugged. "Your choice." Jacob looked at the address again. It wasn't just some random location. It was Emily's apartment. His chest tightened. His voice came out low, dangerous. "You stay away from her." Shane grinned, tapping the table. "Then do the right thing, Jacob. Make this easy." Jacob's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay still. Shane wanted a reaction. He wanted fear, anger, anything that would prove Jacob hadn't really changed. Instead, Jacob stood slowly, pocketing the piece of paper. "You already got your answer." Shane's grin faded, his eyes turning cold. But he didn't stop Jacob as he walked away. Jacob barely made it to his car before his hands started shaking. He gripped the steering wheel, breathing hard. Shane wasn't bluffing. He had never been the kind of man to make empty threats. Jacob had fought so hard to rebuild his life. And now, one wrong step could bring it all crashing down. He needed to warn Emily. The drive to her apartment felt like it took forever, the weight of everything pressing down on him. When he knocked, he half expected her not to answer. Maybe she had already decided he wasn't worth the risk. But after a few seconds, the door opened, and she stood there, her expression unreadable. "Jacob." "I need to talk to you," he said, voice tight. "It's important." She hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was quiet, but he could tell she had been up late. Half-finished tea sat on the counter, and a book lay open on the couch. "What's going on?" she asked. Jacob ran a hand over his face, trying to find the right words. "Someone from my past, Shane, he's trying to pull me back into something I walked away from. And now he's using you to get to me." Emily's eyes darkened. "What do you mean, using me?" Jacob exhaled. "He gave me an address. Your address. It's his way of telling me that if I don't do what he wants, he'll bring this to your doorstep." Emily folded her arms. "And what does he want asterisk?" Jacob hesitated. "Money. Power. To remind me that I don't get to escape my past that easily." Emily studied him for a long moment, then shook her head. "Jacob, this is exactly why I walked away before. You keep dragging all this darkness with you." He looked away, guilt tightening in his chest. "I know, and I don't blame you for not wanting any part of it." A silence stretched between them. When Emily finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "What are you going to do?" Jacob wished he had an answer. "I don't know yet." Before she could respond, a knock echoed at the door. Jacob's blood ran cold. Emily glanced at him before walking toward the door. He moved to stop her, but it was too late. She had already opened it. Standing there, hands tucked in his pockets, was Liam. Jacob felt his stomach twist. He hadn't told Liam about Shane. Hadn't said a word about what was going on. And yet, here he was. Liam's expression was tight, his gaze flicking between Jacob and Emily. "We need to talk," he said. Jacob's instincts screamed that something was wrong. What's going on? Liam sighed, stepping inside. He closed the door behind him, his voice low. I got a call from someone I haven't heard from in a long time. He met Jacob's gaze. Shane. Jacob's breath caught. What? He wanted to remind me that we used to be friends, Liam continued. And he wanted to make sure I knew that if you didn't do what he wanted, I'd be next. Jacob's pulse pounded. This wasn't just about him anymore. Shane was widening his reach, pulling in anyone connected to him. Emily's voice was sharp. How does this end, Jacob? Jacob didn't know. But one thing was clear, Shane wasn't going to stop. And before this was over, Jacob would have to decide just how far he was willing to go to finally break free. Jacob felt the weight of Shane's threats pressing down on him, but it wasn't just about him anymore. If it had only been his life on the line, maybe he could have handled it. But Shane was dragging Emily and Liam into this, making sure Jacob had no escape. That was the part that made his blood run cold. Shane knew exactly how to push him, exactly where it would hurt the most. Liam paced the room, his hands on his hips. We can't just sit here waiting for him to make the next move. Jacob exhaled slowly. I know. Emily crossed her arms. Then what are you going to do? Jacob hesitated. He had spent so much time trying to fix things the right way, trying to make amends and build a new life. But Shane wasn't the kind of man who played fair. The only way to stop this was to cut Shane off completely. He looked at Liam. How did he contact you? Liam pulled out his phone. Blocked number, but he told me to meet him. Jacob's chest tightened. Where? Liam hesitated before answering. The warehouse near the docks. Jacob's stomach twisted. He knew that place. It was where Shane had always done his worst business, where debts were collected and loose ends were tied up. The fact that he was calling Liam there meant only one thing. Shane wasn't planning to just talk. Jacob clenched his fists. I'm going. Emily grabbed his arm. Jacob, no. This is exactly what he wants. Jacob met her eyes. If I don't go, he'll just keep coming after everyone I care about. Liam stepped forward. Then I'm going with you. Jacob shook his head. No. If something goes wrong, I don't want you caught in it. Liam's jaw tightened. I'm not letting you walk into this alone. Jacob sighed but didn't argue. Deep down, he knew he might need backup. The drive to the docks was quiet, the air thick with tension. Jacob's grip tightened around the wheel. He wasn't sure what was waiting for them, but he knew one thing. This was going to end tonight. The warehouse was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. Jacob and Liam stepped inside cautiously, their footsteps echoing against the concrete floor. Then a voice came from the shadows. Right on time. Shane stepped forward, a smirk on his face. But he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, their expressions cold, unreadable. Jacob kept his voice steady. This ends here, Shane. Shane chuckled. That's cute. But see, Jacob, you don't get to decide how this ends. He gestured toward Liam. You brought a friend. How nice. Too bad it won't help you. Jacob's muscles tensed. What do you want? Shane sighed, shaking his head. I told you already. You owe me. He took a slow step forward. And I don't like people who run from their debts. Jacob's jaw clenched. I don't have your money. Shane smirked. I don't want your money, Jacob. I want you. Jacob's stomach dropped. What? Shane's eyes darkened. You were always good at what we did. You got out, sure. But the truth is, guys like us, we don't stay out. He tilted his head. So here's the deal. You come back. You work for me again. At all of this, he gestured around the room. Goes away. Jacob's blood ran cold. He had spent years trying to escape that life. And now Shane was offering him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Liam stepped forward. That's not happening. Shane's smirk widened. I figured you'd say that. He nodded at one of the men beside him. Before Jacob could react, the man pulled out a gun. Everything froze. Jacob's heart pounded as he stared down the barrel. He had known this was dangerous, but he hadn't expected this. Shane sighed. See, Jacob, I was really hoping you'd be smart about this. Jacob swallowed hard. And if I say no? Shane's expression darkened. Then I make sure you don't get the chance to walk away again. The tension in the room was suffocating. Jacob's mind raced. He couldn't go back. But if he made the wrong move now, he wouldn't be walking away at all. Then before anyone could react, a voice rang out from behind them. Put the gun down. Jacob turned just in time to see Emily standing in the doorway, her phone held up. Shane's smirk faltered. What do you think you're doing, sweetheart? Emily didn't back down. I called the cops 5 minutes ago. They'll be here any second. For the first time, Jacob saw uncertainty flicker across Shane's face. He glanced at his men, as if calculating whether this was worth it. Then, with a frustrated sigh, he gestured to the man with the gun. Let's go. Jacob barely had time to exhale before Shane and his men disappeared into the night. The moment they were gone, Emily rushed forward. Are you okay? Jacob nodded, his heart still racing. I can't believe you came. Emily crossed her arms. Did you really think I was just going to let you handle this alone? Liam let out a breath. That was insane, but it worked. Jacob shook his head. This isn't over. Shane doesn't just walk away. Emily met his gaze. Then we'll be ready. Jacob looked at the people standing beside him, the people who had stuck by him despite everything. Maybe Shane was right about one thing. Guys like him didn't just get out, but that didn't mean they had to go back. Jacob had spent his whole life running from his past. But tonight, he had finally faced it. And for the first time, he'd felt free. Jacob stood outside the warehouse, his hands still shaking as he watched Shane disappear into the night. The air felt heavy, like the storm had passed, but the damage it left behind still lingered. He glanced at Emily and Liam, the two people who had risked so much just to stand by him. He didn't deserve that kind of loyalty, but they had given it anyway. Emily sighed, tucking her phone back into her pocket. We should go before the cops get here. Jacob hesitated. You called them, didn't you? She nodded. Yeah, but I doubt Shane will stick around long enough to get caught. He's smarter than that. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. This isn't over. He's going to come back. Liam shook his head. Not if we're ready. The three of them got into Jacob's car, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Jacob could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. He had faced Shane, had looked his past right in the eye, and had chosen something different. Back at Emily's apartment, they sat in the dimly lit living room, the exhaustion catching up with them. Jacob could feel it settling into his bones. Emily leaned forward, studying him. What now? Jacob sighed, leaning back against the couch. I don't know. But I do know one thing. I can't keep living like this, waiting for the past to catch up to me. Liam nodded. Then don't. We'll figure it out. Jacob looked at Emily. And you? Are you still walking away? She held his gaze for a long moment before shaking her head. No, not anymore. Relief flooded through him, but he didn't let himself get too comfortable. He knew that saying the words was one thing, living them was another. The next few days passed in a blur. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Shane was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. He kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see that smirk in the shadows. But as time passed, nothing happened. No calls, no threats, just silence. One evening, as he sat on the balcony of Emily's apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, she stepped outside, handing him a cup of coffee. "You look like you're expecting something," she said softly. Jacob stared at the street below. "I guess I am. Shane doesn't just let things go." Emily sat beside him. Maybe he realized he lost this time. Jacob wasn't sure he believed that, but he nodded anyway. Maybe. She hesitated before speaking again. "I know this isn't over for you, but I also know you're not the same man you used to be." He looked at her, the warmth in her eyes grounding him. "I don't know who I am yet." She smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then figure it out. But don't do it alone this time." Jacob didn't respond, but he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. Weeks passed, and life slowly started to settle into something that almost felt normal. Jacob got a steady job, something simple but honest. Liam helped him put things in order, making sure that whatever ties he still had to his old life were cut for good. And Emily, she stayed. One afternoon, as Jacob closed up at work, Liam showed up, hands in his pockets. "No sign of Shane?" Liam asked. Jacob shook his head. "Nothing. It's like he vanished." Liam exhaled. "Maybe he realized you're not worth the trouble anymore." Jacob chuckled. "That'd be a first." Liam clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You're getting there, man. Just keep moving forward." Jacob nodded. He was trying. Later that night, as he walked home, he stopped at a small park, sitting on one of the benches. He thought about everything that had happened, everything he had done to get here. He wasn't the same man who had run from his past, but he also wasn't completely free of it. Maybe he never would be. But for the first time, that didn't scare him. His phone buzzed, and he pulled it out to see a message from Emily. "Asterisk, dinner's ready. Don't make me eat alone, asterisk." A small smile tugged at his lips. He stood, tucking his phone back into his pocket, and started walking toward home. The past would always be there, lurking in the corners of his mind. But he had something stronger now, people who believed in him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to finally move forward.